Scotland's historic monuments and statues are a window to the past. They signpost significant people and events in the history of the nation. Here in Aberdeen's recently redeveloped Marshall Square, modern glass and concrete office space stands side by side with much older civic history, symbolised by the statue of King Robert the Bruce, granting Aberdeen's freedom lands in the 14th century. But today, the way in which we remember our history and the way in which we present it to ourselves and to others is being seriously questioned. And it's quite clear that some of our monuments and statues are in the firing line. This film looks at 3 Aberdeen statues with connections to Britain's imperial past. Firstly, we look at the statue of Robert Burns, Scotland's bard, whose short life coincided with the early years of Britain's Caribbean Empire. Secondly, we look at the modern statue of the Gordon Highlanders, who, along with other Scottish regiments in the British Army, fought in many of Britain's imperial wars. And lastly, we'll inspect the statue of General Charles Gordon, who died at the Siege of Khartoum in the Sudan in 1885, and who became an icon of Britain's Victorian Empire. What do these statues tell us about the way in which we portray and pass on our history? And what role should they play in the city today and in the future? I'm on my way to visit the statue of Robert Burns near Union Terrace Gardens in the city centre. It was unveiled in front of a huge crowd on the 15th of September 1892, almost a century after Burns's death. Today, the Victorian-era gardens are undergoing a major redevelopment. When completed, the raised walkways, the viewing platforms and the pavilions will transform the gardens and alter the traditional views of the Burns statue. In a similar way, modern values and perspectives influence the way in which Burns himself and his poetry is understood and appreciated today. The poems and songs of Robert Burns have become an enduring emblem of democracy and social justice in Scotland, and indeed around the world. Burns championed the dignity of the rural poor of lowland Scotland and their language, at a time when the country's landed elite was among the most powerful in Europe. And despite his reliance on the patronage of some noble families, in his letters and poetry, Burns questioned the hereditary powers and enormous political influence of Scotland's aristocracy. "Ye see yon birkie ca'd a lord, wha struts and stares and a' that. Though hundreds worship at his word, he's but a coof for a' that. For a' that and a' that, his ribbon, star and a' that. The man o' independent mind, he looks and laughs at a' that." Burns supported many of the ideas of the French Revolution and advocated parliamentary reform in Britain. And although he had aristocratic patrons like the Duke and Duchess of Gordon, he made stinging criticisms of the high-handed actions of landlords against their tenants. Burns was someone who genuinely believed that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be for a' that. Or did he? A number of Burns scholars have recently drawn attention to the fact that in 1786, when Burns was in dire financial straits, he made plans to travel to Jamaica to take up work as an overseer on a plantation owned by Dr. Patrick Douglas of Ayrshire. And Burns knew what would be expected of him there, because although he was signing up to work as a bookkeeper, he described his role in a letter to a friend as that of a poor Negro driver. It comes as a shock that Burns seemed willing to accept that the enslavement of black men and women in the West Indies might be a means to his own advancement. But if he had sailed for Jamaica, he would have been joining thousands of other Scots who emigrated to the Caribbean slave economies, hoping to make enough money to return to Scotland and live in relative comfort. Indeed, the Ayrshire of Burns's time had many connections to slavery. His nearest neighbour's brother, Walter Riddle, owned a plantation in Antigua. The husband of his longtime correspondent, Agnes McElhose, the Clorinda of his letters, was the owner of a plantation in Jamaica. And one of his closest friends, James Smith, emigrated to St. Lucia in 1786. Throughout Scotland, in fact, from the borders to the Highlands, Scots were up to their necks in slavery. In the event, Burns didn't go to the Caribbean. The success of his poems gave him some initial financial security and led him to pursue his literary career in Scotland. But as a poet and writer, he said very little on the subject of slavery and the slave trade. Between 1788 and 1792, during the campaign to abolish the trade, Burns wrote only one short poem, The Slave's Lament, which was critical of the trade, and only expressed support for abolitionist views in a small number of private letters. It might seem unfair or indeed unreasonable to focus on this very brief phase of Burns's life. After all, he decided not to travel to Jamaica. He never worked on a plantation, and Burns had no involvement in slavery or the transatlantic slave trade. But Burns's willingness to consider working there, with all that implied, demonstrates that the influence of Britain's slave empire in the Caribbean was so pervasive and so deeply ingrained among Scots at this time that it could influence even Burns. The crowds who gathered at the opening ceremony of the Burns statue were addressed by the key speaker for the day, Aberdeen-born Professor William Masson. Masson's theme was the central role played by Scotland within the British Empire, and was perfectly represented by the use of the Union Jack to unveil the statue and the hoisting of the saltire on the flagpole behind it. Professor Masson enlisted Burns in support of Britain's imperial project. He asked his audience to imagine a Scottish regiment under heavy fire in a campaign on foreign soil. In the midst of desperate fight for survival, the words of Burns' Scots Whahae rings out from one of the soldiers. The regiment rallies, advances, and carries all before it. If Masson had a real Scottish regiment in mind, then it was probably this one, the 92nd or Gordon Highlanders, who've had a long association with the northeast of Scotland. And despite the placing of some poppies at the base of the plinth here, this is not a war memorial. It was erected in 2011 to celebrate the history of the Gordons as a separate regiment before their amalgamation with the Queen's Own Highlanders. The regiment had a long and illustrious past, detailed in numerous regimental and military histories, and in the displays of the Regimental Museum in Aberdeen. It was formed in 1794 by the Duke of Gordon, fought in the Napoleonic Wars, and was present at the Battle of Waterloo at the famous charge of the Scots Greys. With other Scottish regiments in the British Army, the Gordons endured the suffering and slaughter of trench warfare in the First World War and helped to defend the nation against fascism in the Second. But the golden thread which links the regiment to its past also connects the Gordons to the many imperial campaigns in which Britain imposed its rule on weaker societies in Africa, Asia and the Middle East, and justified this with the assertion that the British were racially superior and deserved to rule the inferior races of the world. One such race included the enslaved men and women in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. In 1819, the 92nd Regiment was posted to Jamaica, to which Robert Burns had considered emigrating 30 years earlier. The regiment's duties included the prevention and suppression of slave resistance. The regiment's defence of Britain's slave empire came at enormous cost. Between 1819 and 1827, when it returned to Britain, the regiment lost 860 men and dependents, mainly to yellow fever and malaria. The number of deaths greatly exceeded the 92nd's losses for the whole of the Napoleonic Wars. As Britain's empire expanded in the 19th century, the regiment contributed to campaigns in many parts of the world, including Afghanistan, India, Egypt and South Africa. Some of the regiment's most heroic exploits were undertaken extending and defending the empire. When Piper George Findlater won the VC on the heights of Dargai in present-day Pakistan, in one of the Gordons' most famous engagements, the regiment was taking part in one of a series of expeditions designed to punish and intimidate communities who contested British control on the northwest frontier of India. Punitive expeditions and collective punishment became the default policy of the British Army when dealing with people the British regarded as racially inferior. Winston Churchill, who was a young war correspondent on the northwest frontier in 1897, justified the burning of villages and the destruction of crops on the grounds that Britain's enemies were Stone Age savages and that every villager was a potential combatant. Some of the tactics used in these punitive expeditions were applied in the Second South African or Boer War between 1899 and 1902. Churchill's famous quotation that the Gordons were the finest regiment in the world refers to the storming of Boer positions at Doornkop near Johannesburg in 1900. But traditional military tactics like that changed into a ferocious guerrilla war in which British tactics changed to the burning of Boer farms, the destruction of their livestock and the internment of civilians, mainly women and children, in specially constructed camps. By 1901, these camps were referred to in the British Parliament as concentration camps. Both the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Gordon Highlanders were involved in destroying farms and livestock and clearing Boer families to the camps. As the policy of burning and clearance was extended, and thousands of Boer women and children were housed in poorly resourced and in sanitary camps, outbreaks of measles and typhoid killed many thousands of inmates, mainly children under 16. A detailed report by the pacifist Emily Hobhouse, who visited many of the camps in 1901, led to a major scandal in Britain and criticism of the government and military commanders. Emily Hobhouse was quite clear where the blame lay. It is one thing to admire marching regiments. It's quite another to be dominated and ruled by these regiments. Her report led to an official investigation by an all-female commission of inquiry led by Millicent Fawcett. This led to the transfer of the camps to civilian administration and improvements in conditions. But neither Emily Hobhouse nor the Fawcett Commission visited any of the separate camps of black South Africans who had also been cleared from the veldt. Recent research by scholars in South Africa has revealed that in these camps, conditions were even worse and the death rates even higher. Far from freeing black South Africans from Boer racism, as some British supporters of the war claimed, the war actually intensified their oppression. Africans cleared from farms were forced to labour for the British Army, building blockhouses, driving wagons and working in the camps. Black South Africans were treated as a labour pool for the army, and there was no transfer of the African camps to civilian control. Racial thinking permeated every aspect of the Empire's war in South Africa, and racism was British as well as Boer. There is no denying the courage of the Gordon Highlanders in 2 centuries of service and sacrifice. But their military exploits in expanding and defending the British Empire had a very different meaning for those on the receiving end. In his poem The Freedom Come All Ye, Scots poet Hamish Henderson, who was himself a veteran of the 51st Highland Division in the Second World War, reflects on the need for Scots to come to terms with their role in imperial conquest. In the poem, Henderson imagines a time when the Scottish regiments would no longer be the servants of empire, and broken families in lands we've herred will curse Scotland the brave. Nae mair, nae mair. The heroic exploits of Scottish regiments, and Highland regiments in particular, became one of the defining images of Britain's Victorian Empire. But nobody symbolised the Empire better than an officer in the Royal Engineers, Major General Charles Gordon, whose statue is here in School Hill, near the city centre. The Gordon statue was unveiled by the Marquis of Huntly just 3 years after Gordon's death in the siege of Khartoum in the Sudan. Although both Gordon and his father were born in England, more distant family links led the Marquis to claim Gordon as one of the noblest sons of Scotland. Gordon's death in January 1885 brought to an end an extraordinary life, triggered an outpouring of grief across Britain, and fueled a cult of Gordon, which proclaimed him as the Empire's finest soldier and administrator. Gordon's early reputation was forged in China in the 1860s, when Britain and other Western countries were forcing China to open up to Western trade and political influence. Gordon was part of the British force which blew up the Emperor's summer palace in 1863. Later, he accepted a position commanding a mercenary force fighting for the Emperor against the Taiping rebels, who were attempting to overthrow the Manchu dynasty. His military exploits helped to create the legend of Chinese Gordon. Stories about the young British Army officer, always leading from the front, armed not with his revolver but only with his cane, were lapped up by the British public. After China, Gordon was posted to Gravesend, where his role was to upgrade the forts at the entrance to the River Thames. During his period there, he assisted the poor and the destitute of the town, and also established a school for the training and education of poor orphan boys. Gordon followed his own unique form of Christianity. He never married and avoided most social situations, and began to acquire the reputation of a soldier saint. His fame reached its height because of his exploits in the Sudan. When Egypt fell under British influence in the 1870s, after the opening of the Suez Canal made Egypt strategically important for Britain's trade to India, the Egyptian government chose Gordon to establish effective rule in its own neighbouring colony of the Sudan. Gordon's confrontations with slave traders and his epic travels and explorations to the Upper Nile became the stuff of legend. Queen Victoria was one of his biggest admirers. Gordon was often portrayed by friends and supporters as an almost saint-like figure, but in reality he could be an arrogant and ruthless operator. And while he was genuinely appalled by the violence and suffering of slave raiding, he accepted that the institution of slavery itself would be in existence for many years to come, and he was prepared to compromise with slave owners and traders. Many of the Sudanese soldiers he commanded were themselves conscripted slaves. At times, Gordon displayed genuine empathy for the people of the Sudan, and often praised the skills and bravery of his black Sudanese soldiers. But he never questioned the idea of a racial hierarchy, which placed Africans, Indians, Arabs, and Chinese below Europeans. It was partly Gordon's egotism that led him to accept a government mission in 1884 to go back to the Sudan. Britain had taken control of Egypt in 1882 by crushing a nationalist movement at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir. In Egypt's colony of the Sudan, a resistance movement now developed which aimed to rid the Sudan of Egyptian and British influence. It was led by the Islamic scholar and Mahdi Muhammad Ahmad and attracted many thousands of devout Sufi followers or dervishes. The Liberal government of William Gladstone did not want Britain to become involved in a war in the Sudan and decided to withdraw all the Egyptian garrisons stationed there. Some members of the government suggested that Gordon was clearly the man for the job after his years of service in the Sudan. Others suspected that Gordon believed the government was not being imperialist enough and that he might try to force a confrontation with the Mahdi. But Gordon had friends in high places, and when he was offered the mission to evacuate the garrisons in the Sudan, he was seen off at Charing Cross train station by no less than the Foreign Secretary Lord Granville, Queen Victoria's cousin, the Duke of Cambridge, who was Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, and by the war hero General Sir Garnet Wolseley, who had to give Gordon some money because he had forgotten to bring any. Gordon travelled to Khartoum, the capital of the Sudan, and was killed there with thousands of Egyptian and Sudanese soldiers in the garrison after a siege lasting almost a year. A British relief column sent reluctantly by Gladstone's government arrived too late to rescue the garrison. Gordon's death at the hands of Muslim soldiers cemented his status as a Christian martyr. It contributed to the Liberal government losing the general election of 1886 and undermined the reputation of Prime Minister William Gladstone, who was blamed for Gordon's death. After his death, the spin doctors of the empire went into overdrive, helping to create the legend of Gordon, the soldier saint. 13 years later, Britain decided to occupy the Sudan, and a combined Egyptian and British force defeated the army of the Mahdi's successor at the Battle of Omdurman near Khartoum in 1898. The British Army's battle cry was revenge for Gordon, but the real reason for the occupation of the Sudan was to forestall the expansion of the French Empire in the area. After the battle, many wounded Mahdi's soldiers were killed on the battlefields. The Mahdi's tomb was blown up and his skeleton desecrated. General Kitchener held a memorial service for Gordon near the spot where years before he had been killed. The desecration of the tomb and the killing of wounded soldiers led to some criticism in Britain, and Queen Victoria demanded an explanation from Kitchener. But the explanations were accepted, and Kitchener was rewarded for the victory and given the title Baron Kitchener of Khartoum. In some ways, Gordon is an unlikely symbol of the empire. Over his many years of service to it, he became critical of several aspects of imperial rule, and particularly of its well-paid and well-dressed officials. But Gordon could never doubt the right of the British to rule what he and others called the subject races. When he was besieged in Khartoum, he was already planning a final mission to help King Leopold of Belgium establish control over the people and the resources of the Congo. Right up until the end, Gordon believed that white men like himself had an unquestionable duty to command, and that the people of the subject races had an unquestionable duty to obey. In his poem To a Louse, Robert Burns imagines a louse crawling up the bonnet of a young woman as she sits in church.
O would some power the gift gie us, to see ourselves as others see us. It would frae mony a blunder free us, and foolish notion. What airs and dress and gait would leave us, and even devotion.
Burns was describing much more than simply the embarrassment of not being able to see something which someone else can. His poem asks us to consider things from another's point of view. And that's a test that the three statues fail to pass, because they all expect just one response, and that is unqualified admiration. But the world changes, and so does our attitude to statues. The statue of General Gordon, which was erected in Trafalgar Square in London in 1888, was removed in 1943 to make way for an RAF exhibition, showcasing a new generation of heroes defending an empire in crisis. The statue spent 10 years in storage and was then re-erected on a less prestigious site on the Thames embankment. And shortly after the Sudan gained independence from Britain in 1956, the Sudanese government removed the statue of Gordon in Khartoum and sent it back to Britain, where it stands today in the grounds of the Gordon School in Surrey. Today, increasing numbers of people are questioning the place of many of our statues. Should we leave them alone on their pedestals, or should they be used to genuinely inform us about the lives and times of the people they depict? Facing up to our past can be an uncomfortable and unsettling experience, but our statues need to open up debate and not be used to close it down. Information boards, digital links, and augmented reality around statues should connect us to the consensus of expert views. And the information presented should be renewed and updated as our understanding of history improves and develops. The spaces around statues could also provide opportunities for genuine public interaction. Ultimately, we need to decide whether our statues speak for us or just at us. The way in which we depict and display our history needs to be accurate and honest, and our statues should help to tell the stories of all of the people involved in our collective history. Our museums too, including our regimental and military museums, which often celebrate imperial and colonial campaigns, should honour the victims of empire and not just the victors. But in order to do this, we have to be genuinely willing to see ourselves as others see us.